Good afternoon, everyone who's tuning in. This is the first episode of the First Talks series organized by green ammonia pioneer First Ammonia and Sustainable Public Affairs. My name is Leon de Graaf, and I'll be moderating today's event on something that I guess is on everyone's mind, the Inflation Reduction Act of the United States and the potential response that the EU can bring in this regard. So to talk about this today, I'm joined by two very well able speakers on this topic. First off is Mr. Hunter Johnston, who is a partner at Steptoe & Johnson, which is an international law firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. And over there, he's leading a practice focused on all things related to renewable energy and decarbonization policy. Hunter's legal experience really extends over 35 years. So, I'm very happy to have him with us today to explain a little bit more about the US IRA. So welcome, Hunter. Of course, we're also joined by First Ammonia itself, the organizer. And with us today is Mr. Joel Moser, who has also been practicing law for a very extensive amount of time, 30 years, also at global law firms related to international energy and infrastructure. But today he's, the CEO of First Ammonia. And I just want to tell a bit more about First Ammonia because they're actually developing the first modular commercial scale plants to produce green ammonia, which is a form of green hydrogen from intermittent renewable energy. And the first one's actually to use the solid oxide electrolysers of the Danish company Topsoe. So I'm very happy to dive into this topic because Hunter, maybe just start off with you, setting the background. I think I speak for everyone here on the call, everyone who's joining in, that whatever meeting they're in nowadays, you cannot escape the United States Inflation Reduction Act. So maybe you can set the scene a little bit and talk us through the key aspects of this, so-called energy security and climate change package, which is around, $369 billion. Maybe you can tell us a little bit what that's about and what it concerns related to clean electricity and clean hydrogen.
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to everyone this afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I will attempt to provide a high-level overview of the Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, it's a voluminous piece of legislation, but I specifically want to focus on, as you mentioned, the clean energy specific and the monetization options for tax credits, and specifically the hydrogen tax credit, since that's of great interest to First Ammonia and the people on this webinar. As a general introduction, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed through a special legislative process in the United States that was used by the United States Congress as reconciliation, which is one of those funny terms, but what it really means is reconciliation of the budget. So the reconciliation process is a revenue or a tax process, which means that provisions in the bill must affect the revenue of the United States. And so just as a general reference point, this is really a tax bill, a tax vehicle, as opposed to a more regulatory type of piece of legislation. So the subsidies that everyone talks about in the IRA, they're really what they are, they're tax subsidies. And it is interesting that the United States has chosen to use tax credits as the direct means to incentivize clean energy. Certainly, tax credits are less efficient than direct subsidies, but tax credits have the advantage that they're available according to open standards of qualification that ensure that project sponsors can get the tax credit if those sponsors or developers can meet objective criteria that is developed by the government through rulemaking and a regulatory process. So there's no competition for these subsidies. They're just openly available if you meet objective criteria. So in the case of the IRA, it was a hodgepodge of different tax credits, some of which were extended and enhanced, but there were also a variety of new tax credit provisions that were included in the IRA that that weren't in the tax code before. And part of the new features of what the IRA brings about are new monetization provisions, which are key to the overall structure of the IRA, in that it provides more certainty to taxpayers that they can turn tax credits into cash, either directly from the U.S. government or from third parties through this credit transfer mechanism. So that's kind of a high-level overview. I'll hit some key points about the legislation and how it was passed. I think people know that it started it was sort of a tortured process, but it passed the United States Senate on a 50-50 vote. So it was really a Democratic-led bill with Vice President Harris providing this tie vote. It's President Biden's signature domestic policy achievement. It as we mentioned, it includes significant investments in clean energy, climate, and healthcare that's paid for through a new minimum tax on large corporations and savings from allowing Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices. The total in energy and climate spending, as you mentioned, Leon, is $369 billion, and at that amount, it's the largest United States federal investment ever in climate and clean energy policy. And of that $369 billion, $270 billion is related to these tax credit incentives that I was mentioning, that I was talking about. The clean energy tax credits were on the electricity side, were provided a long-term extension up to 10 years with production tax credits and investment tax credits in legacy wind and solar applications, transitioning to new technology neutral credits that are extended until greenhouse gas emissions from the production of electricity in the United States are equal or less than 25% of 2022 levels. So they're legacy tax credits that were extended, but they transition as the U.S. electricity mix becomes less carbon intensive. As I mentioned, to allow for further use and encourage development, the IRA allows taxpayers in certain instances to claim the tax credits as a direct payment from the government, and it also allows for transferability of the credits to third parties in exchange for cash. The IRA also ties the full value of the number of credits to projects meeting prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, including incremental tax credits for domestic contents and investment in certain communities. So a basic feature of the entire bill and of the subsidy amounts are provisions in it that require payment of essentially prevailing wage standards in the United States. So it's meant to reinforce the U.S. labor pool. Yeah. And as I mentioned, there's also this transitioning that happens. Now on monetization options, what does that really mean? Another way to think of monetization, and probably for this audience, people are asking themselves, what good does it do for a company to have tax credits if you have no tax liability? So that's really what monetization is all about. So up until the IRA was passed, a taxpayer having no tax liability would have to figure out a way to form a partnership with another taxpayer with tax liability to monetize the tax credits. These types of tax partnerships are called tax equity partnerships, and are commonly found in the renewable energy industry in the U.S. That's the basic way where most developers monetize tax credits if you have no tax liability. But these types of partnerships are complex and inefficient and require a lot of legal fees for people like me in order to put together. So what did the IRA provide? Well, it provides this direct pay mechanism, which applies to all taxpayers for the carbon capture tax credits, and also for the clean hydrogen tax credits, and also for something called the clean energy manufacturing tax credit. So it's not available in all cases in the IRA, but these three areas get this direct pay mechanism. And it's available for the first 5 years of the credit period, after which the credits again become non-refundable for those taxpayers. Okay. Direct pay is a feature that starts right away in 2023. And the second monetization option that's available for all taxpayers is this transfer provision that basically allows taxpayers who otherwise wouldn't be eligible for direct pay, or after the direct pay period has finished, to elect to transfer all or a portion of the tax credits to an unrelated taxpayer in exchange for cash. So what it does is it allows you just to have a transaction where you can transfer tax credits to somebody who has taxpayer liabilities willing to pay you money. So that transferability election has a potential to dramatically increase the effectiveness of the rest of those tax credits, and to be an option for instance, a hydrogen tax credit after the first 5 years. And it will reduce transaction costs and the need to go through one of these tax equity partnerships that are referenced. Treasury implementation and guidance are going to be key. So many details regarding implementation of the transfer provision remain to be worked out. But one downside of the transfer is that it does not extend the depreciation deductions, which are often used along with these clean energy tax credits to subsidize the clean energy tax credits. So that starts in 2023. So finally, I want to end with a discussion about the hydrogen tax credit, which is exciting and unprecedented in both value and scope and scale. It provides a base rate of 60 cents a kilogram and a bonus rate of $3 a kilogram for hydrogen produced in the United States, meeting certain carbon intensity profile requirements. So in order to be eligible for the full credit, a facility must produce hydrogen with a carbon intensity on a life cycle well-to-gate basis from the Oregon National Lab GREET model, which is known in the United States and developed by the Department of Energy, of less than 4 kilograms of CO2e or equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen produced. So you get 100% of the credit if you're less than 0.45 kilograms. Obviously, a completely green hydrogen project would qualify for 100% of the credit, but it does also qualify so-called blue hydrogen on a variety of lesser amounts, from 33.4% of the credit to 20% of the credit, depending on where you fall on that carbon intensity scale. Taxpayers do have the option of electing to claim up to a 30% investment tax credit in lieu of this production tax credit. So in other words, for a 30% tax credit on the value of the property that is associated with production of the hydrogen, as opposed to a production tax credit, which I was referring to before, based upon the kilograms of hydrogen produced. All right. The credit is available from 2023 until the end of 2033. The credit period is 10 years. And the basic requirement is that the hydrogen must be produced in the United States in the ordinary course of business and then sold or used. Yeah. And then finally, there's this requirement that the production of the hydrogen must be verified by an independent third party. Okay. That's basically it.
Okay. Well, I think that's very clear for the audience, how it works, and also basically the fact that, what you said also at the beginning, that basically it offers a lot of investment certainty beforehand. If you check the boxes also beforehand, that you are almost, that you can be relatively certain that you are eligible for this tax credit. Maybe just to move on to Joel, you as CEO of a company, First Ammonia, that is interested to invest both in the United States and in the EU with, several gigawatts, or your 5 gigawatt agreement with Topsoe for these electrolysers. Could you just explain a little bit, what you're planning in terms of investments in the US and Europe, and what the IRA has changed for you?
Sure. Thank you, Leon. We're a new company. Our business model is to make pure green ammonia, to do that by operating intermittently so that we are synergistic with the generation of renewable power. We are based in the US, so we are headquartered as a US company, but in Europe, we're actually a European company. In Germany, we're a GmbH, and we have an office in Berlin. Our head of engineering is in Berlin. We've just opened up an affiliate in Denmark, where we're going to be establishing a headquarters for technology and construction, and we've hired some excellent people in Denmark as well. And we set out to do this a couple of years ago in 2020, and made some very basic decisions, important decisions. The first was to partner with the legendary engineering firm from Denmark, Topsoe. They were at the time setting out to commercialize the world's first solid oxide electrolyser cells, which are a form of electrolyzer that is more efficient than existing formats. We became their launch customer. We've been working with them continuously since then. And a few months ago, we signed a 500 megawatt expandable to 5 gigawatt forward purchase agreement. That's a lot of electrolyzers, and electrolyzers are the key component to making green hydrogen and any power to X product from green hydrogen, including green ammonia, which is what we will make. We also set out to identify sites as our initial sites, and also sites around the world, because that's a lot of production. Our initial sites were to be in Germany. And at the time, Europe, and specifically Germany, were the most friendly jurisdictions for decarbonization, public policy benefits, financial benefits. Nothing was happening in the US. And we were well along, and we have had and have 2 excellent sites in northern Germany near the offshore wind in the North Sea that are pretty much ready to go. One was and will be about 100 megawatts. The other one was initially sized at about 300 megawatts. So that was all going well. And then, of course, there was a war. And the war led to several different things that impact directly upon our plans. One is it, in my view, tended to slow down the process of providing the kind of financial support that these projects required, because priorities shifted. Even though we had a Repower EU program, initial priorities were to get LNG appropriately and necessarily. But just to give you some context, in one of our sites, we have applied for a grant from the German federal government. We were initially approved at a staff level. The government changed, the program changed. Even as the German government is intending to encourage the production, there isn't a new program yet in place. They're working in earnest. I think actually perhaps today or yesterday, there was an announcement of a plan for import of ammonia, and we can get back later on and talk about import versus domestic production. But we're not making strides on that. We also applied for an innovation fund grant. The people who administer that program at the EU level are excellent. They've been very supportive. We did not actually get it for our first round. We're applying again. The application is more streamlined, which is really nice to see. They've taken out some of the burdensome requirements. And I believe we will build both of our projects in Germany as we've set out, but we're very unlikely to build gigawatts of production in Germany or Europe, anywhere in Europe, because the other major change that happened that no one could have really predicted, except maybe Hunter, who has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in Washington, is that a few months ago, the IRA passed. And from a user perspective, I'm a way former lawyer, so I look at this as a client. Basically, I'm getting a lot of money to build a project to make hydrogen or hydrogen products in the US. So we have sites, and we actually have sites on 5 continents, the US, South America, in Asia and Africa, but our US sites, and we have 2 sites under control in the US, 2 excellent sites. We could do over a gigawatt right now on those sites. I look at this not on the price, on the value per amount of hydrogen. I look at it ammonia. Without revealing too much insider information, I will say that the direct pay mechanism under the IRA pretty much means the US government is paying us over $500 a metric ton for the ammonia we make. Again, I won't give out too much inside information, but let me just sort of say in a more generalized way, that's most of what it costs us to make it. It's hard to argue with that. So when we started this enterprise a couple of years ago, a lot of discussion about what the price of green ammonia will be in the market, how much more it will trade over the price of conventional ammonia, what's its price comparator to bunker fuel, where it's going to replace marine fuels. And everyone's expectation was that there's going to be a premium over these hydrocarbon-based fuels, and in the case of ammonia, as in its traditional use as a fertilizer, hydrocarbon-based fertilizer. Well, right now we can make green ammonia in the US with that subsidy and make money selling it at a price point way lower than conventional ammonia and lower than the hydrocarbon based alternatives. I hope our potential off-takers and customers aren't listening to me, because we'll be negotiating for prices. But it's hard to argue at the moment that it makes any sense, except in very selected circumstances, as we will likely do in our current projects in Europe. But as a general proposition, it doesn't make any sense at the moment to set out to build a hydrogen or Power-to-X project anywhere in the world but the US. Now that I expect will change, and I think it's going to change first in Europe, where there's discussions about what to do in response. The president of the European Union has spoken about this even just a few days ago. The governments within Europe will be addressing this, whether or not they can pass tax laws or subsidies. But I would say that as a recommendation, as an outsider, not only does the money need to come out in large amounts to be competitive, and I certainly would imagine that Europe does not want to be just an import market. I mean, I can't imagine that Europe wants to trade reliance upon Russian natural gas for reliance upon American ammonia, although that's probably a safer bet, but still, in terms of domestic security and the integrity of internal markets, I would imagine that Europe and its countries want to have a robust domestic supply, even as they're importing. But there's going to have to be a lot of money. It should be easy. I don't have to apply for the IRA. No disrespect intended for any other programs. I've, in my career, done a lot of program applications for US, but the way this is done as a tax law provision, as Hunter was saying, is you get a tax opinion and you comply with the regulations and you get the money. No application required. It is as of right. So it's simple. These projects are complicated enough to build and get done to take off the table an application process, and the uncertainty of the award is great. And then finally, I would recommend early. We have there's a lot of capital out there that is intended to encourage the production of green products for decarbonization. And yet when you look at the program criteria, they're very much like bank criteria. The money comes in when everything's in place. When everything's in place, we don't need the money. If you want to encourage us to be undertaking a project, the best way to do is make the money available at an early stage. That's when it's hard to get. I also would say that in earlier times of my career, I worked on projects where states in the United States have competed with each other separate from federal programs. I can't imagine that the EU would want to replicate that kind of a mess. It seems to me that this is something which should be coordinated. I know that there are competition rules that are sorted out in Brussels. I would recommend unified schemes, EU-wide, however they're done, whether presumably as a combination of federal legislation and EU legislation, but make it simple, make it sufficiently rich, and then the same things that are about to be happening and are already underway in Texas and other parts of the Southwest, and frankly, all around the country in the United States, will be happening in the EU. And we'll be happy because the truth is that both of our current sites in Germany are expandable. We could do 2 gigawatts in Germany. There's no question that we will, there's no way we will do that without the kind of supports from the EU and Germany in net that we'll be getting in the US. So that's the way forward.
Yeah, no, that's very clear, Joe. I have a couple of questions for you on that that common approach that you were talking about. But maybe first, Hunter, because everything that's been said right now, you've also seen that United States President Biden had indicated to French President Macron when he visited the United States that he could potentially, also tweak the IRA to make it easier for European businesses to participate in the IRA. What is your assessment on if and how that could potentially be possible?
So that's a question that a lot of people are asking right now, and if you look at the news coverage with President Macron's visit to the United States, of course, there was some positive talks in commitment by President Biden to do whatever he could do in order to address some of these issues about competitiveness with the EU. But some of it was about domestic content, and I think some of it was related to domestic requirements with respect to batteries and what does that do with the automobile market. But if you read carefully the reaction of key members of the Congress, there's almost no appetite to open up the Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, in the United States, the Congress makes the laws and the executive branch implements the laws. So it's really limited what the administration can do, because these are by and large the problems that are seen from a European point of view are mostly issues that are in the law, and so that the president by himself cannot just change the law. If the regulations allow for certain interpretations that are friendly, one of them was to treat a European country like a North American country with respect to sourcing of the critical minerals for batteries, for instance. Even that's going to be a hard sell, because that part was written into the law. So, but I really don't see any of these issues with respect to the hydrogen tax credit rewritten anytime soon, especially because the House of Representatives, as we know in the new Congress, is going to be controlled by the Republicans. And as I mentioned on the front end, this bill was passed in a process, the reconciliation process, which has been used most recently in the last 3 or 4 administrations as a means of implementing legislation for which there's partisan agreement, but not bipartisan agreement. So that's what was done here. No Republicans really supported the IRA. So the focus is going to be on implementing the bill and not changing the bill. Unless it was in an area of bipartisan agreement. And truthfully, in the United States, this notion of reshoring or reestablishing U.S. supply chains and reinvesting in labor and in U.S. manufacturing capabilities, especially as it relates to competitiveness versus China. That is the one thing that's agreed on by both parties. Both parties want to accomplish that, and I think what we're going to see over the next Congress, beginning in January, is maybe more legislating in a way that makes that continues this move to invest in U.S. Businesses and U.S. supply chains and manufacturing capability.
Okay. Now that's very clear. I mean, so of course, Joel, when looking at when given what Hunter also just presented, and you've also alluded a little bit to it already, but of course, again, you said you've already illustrated a little bit of what you think, you would need also in Europe in order, to really invest also here, and also not just you, also other green technology entrepreneurs. But what, I think what a lot of people are also looking for is, what companies can really do so that it is really made in Europe also, and I think also, what you're alluding to, you're working together with Topsoe, a Danish company, making all these electrolysers. This could really be also something that could be, that could be done in Europe. What could you elaborate a little bit more when you said around, what Europe can do jointly, together with all the countries in terms of maybe the joint borrowing or other types of things that you think about, that Europe can do to make it a key place for, green ammonia and green hydrogen investments?
Absolutely. Just to be clear, all of the electrolysers that we are going to be installing, wherever they go, are going to be made in Europe. They're going to be made by Topsoe at their new plant in Herning in Denmark. And in fact, we're also working with Topsoe for the ammonia side of our production. So our production is two parts, it's an integrated system to make hydrogen, and then the hydrogen gets converted into ammonia. The ammonia synthesis part is being designed by Topsoe, the Danish company, and we will be selecting fabrication yards, and several of them may in fact be in Europe. And much of our senior level design and engineering will be staffed in Europe through our Berlin and Copenhagen offices. Others will do this too. So I think that Europe will be an export market for equipment and technology, but what it will not be is a place where there is domestic production of power to X, fuels and chemicals, which is a very strange situation because Germany in particular has long had a storied chemical industry. The Haber-Bosch process, which is how one makes ammonia in the first place and still makes ammonia, was invented in Germany. Germany and the rest of Europe can continue to be places where power to X products, including ammonia and pure hydrogen, can be made. There's no technical limitation. There are some limitations on the amount of renewable power. We can talk about that a little bit later. There's no question that Europe, were it to switch to a hydrogen-based energy system, which one hopes it will, it's the right thing to do, will likely be a net importer. And that's not an unusual situation. If you look at the history of petrochemical, of oil and gas-based power, some countries are energy exporters and some countries are energy importers. The energy exporters of the future will be countries like Chile, where there are excess renewable power resources in excess of what the country itself can produce, and that will float as ammonia, whether when it arrives in Europe, it's cracked back into hydrogen, or I think more efficiently, in my personal view, used as a fuel as ammonia, is a question for the ultimate end users to decide. But as I mentioned before, I can't imagine that Europe wants to be solely an importer, so it's dependent upon whatever kind of future issues of distribution, of trade wars, of wars. One never knows. When the world became reliant upon petrochemical energy 100 years ago, they didn't imagine that there would be oil embargoes, or what's happening with Russia today, for example. So it seems quite plain that Europe and the countries within Europe need to have a robust domestic production capacity. And so that's really just about money, because power is expensive in Europe. So they can't compete on the basis of power, and power is very expensive now. There isn't a whole lot of space to build out new additional renewable energy. There'll be some new wind resources developed in the North Sea. And with the US setting sort of the global standard of financial subsidy, the EU is going to have to, whether on a joint borrowing basis, on a grant basis, or one thing we've heard a lot about is the likelihood of a contract for difference. A contract for difference is basically a floor price that could essentially achieve the same thing that the IRA has achieved if it's high enough. So the US doesn't always get things right. There have been some very messy programs for all kinds of things. They kind of got this one right. The hydrogen tax credit is sort of the silver bullet. I think that people that are looking at this and understanding it from both sides are sort of coming to the realization that they couldn't really believe something this powerful would happen. So I don't know whether countries within Europe have tax equity kind of structures, whether they can replicate precisely. But there's no reason why they should try within the structures that they, at Brussels and Berlin and and Paris, other federal capitals, within the structures of their programs, need to figure out ways in coordination with each other and not in competition with each other, I would imagine, to get to a level where it makes sense to make this stuff there. And there's lots and lots of former petrochemical infrastructure that can be repurposed to hydrogen and ammonia production. It just gets down to national policy. If Europe and the countries of Europe don't want to solely rely upon import, they're going to have to step up to the plate, or companies will not have the economic incentive, because ultimately, look, there's going to be a market for this. There's going to be a price. People will compete for price. Buyers will want to pay the least possible for my product. People will be saying, well, I want to pay X. I'm not going to give out some numbers again, but I want to pay this and not that. And the answer is, to get to the price that you want, I got to make it in the US because that's where I have the subsidy. I can make it in Europe, but I won't clear the market with the price because my net production cost is not offset by sufficient federal policy programs.
Yeah, no, but I think from what that's a very interesting answer. And I think also, when you look at, for instance, the speech of Commission President von der Leyen, which I thought was a great speech, she also seems to be very well aware, looking closely at, what can Europe potentially do, around its own state aid rules, can they be more transparent, or in any way, other ways adjusted for, looking at this global competition. I think there was also, Commissioner Thierry Breton, who said what you just said around the joint borrowing, that if Europe borrows together, then it's also, it's also really an EU response, to this IRA, because that would allow all member states, all companies from all member states, to basically access this money from the joint borrowing. And really interesting also that you mentioned, what's going on in the EU regarding these contract for differences, which will of course also be part of the EU emissions trading system. I think also, there's probably other things that can be done there, for instance, regarding the innovation fund, where there's just so many, allowances that are in there, worth tens of billions of euros. But maybe some of those or a lot of those need to come online and be front loaded in order to get enough money to have as a response to the IRA. So that's really interesting also that you said that. We've gotten a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is for you, Joel, which is a question around the export of ammonia. So do you expect that that First Ammonia will export ammonia to the EU thanks to the IRA? And specifically also, will the IRA be sufficient to compensate for transport costs and conversion into hydrogen, or to use ammonia as a pure fuel?
Yeah, absolutely. We will be exporting from our U.S. our U.S. production to Europe. In fact, we're already in discussions with European buyers for product which is likely to be produced in our U.S. facilities, unquestionably. The IRA, as I mentioned earlier, covers substantially all of our production costs. It's a subsidy that's it's amazing how deep it is. The transportation cost of ammonia is quite minimal. It's a simple thing. 185 million metric tons of ammonia are made each year today, and about 40% of it floats. It adds very few dollars per ton to move it. If you once it gets there, if you want to crack it, if that's your choice, that's an inexpensive process. You'd have to crack it, to use it as hydrogen. We actually are very bullish on using ammonia as a direct fuel, but that's perhaps a topic for a different first talks.
Yeah, no, definitely. Maybe just moving on, Hunter, there is also a question from the audience around the IRA and the hydrogen production credit, where hydrogen has to be produced in the US to benefit from the funding. It does not contain a domestic content requirement for hydrogen producing equipment as such, but do you think that the domestic content requirement, for instance, for that is also applying for electrolysers, or is that not the case?
It's not the case.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's a very quick and clear answer. I think that's also, these local content requirements, I think, are, as you said, part of the concern that European leaders have. But if you say also that the local content requirement does not apply to electrolyzers, then that's great to hear.
Yeah, I would just make one comment about that, and that some of these provisions that you would have thought that would have been in keeping with some of the themes like domestic content, they ended up not being included because of the reality of this special process that the Congress used, this reconciliation process, was that there had to be a nexus to the revenues. And so some of these requirements, some of these notions of domestic content requirements, they just didn't make the test, and they were considered to be extraneous policy requirements. And so the politicians were constrained from imposing further qualifications on some of these credits, even though they succeeded in the context of the battery manufacturing. But that was very difficult to achieve, and we don't have to go through the details as to why that got done, and it wasn't applied elsewhere. But that's also fundamental, for instance, with the structure of the bill as it relates to the labor provisions. They have a base rate, and then a higher rate if you do the labor provision. So that's the way they imposed labor provisions, was to do it on this sort of bonus structure and base structure basis. So it gives you a little bit more insight into why the bill reads the way that it does. It is complex and confusing, but that was the nature of this reconciliation process.
Okay, and just, you know, because we have a lot of tech savvy and tech savvy people on the line, will the U.S. produced electrolysers provide the 10% bonus to hydrogen producers on top of the clean hydrogen production credit? That's the, I don't know if that is clear.
No, the bonus does not apply here, although it does apply in wind and solar in other instances.
Okay. Okay, so we're heading into the questions also regarding the ETS allowances. So if an EU producer would receive ETS allowances for investment purposes, would it be a problem that the value of these allowances is uncertain and fluctuating? I don't know, I guess. I don't know if that's an answer. I don't know if that's a question that we can all answer. I think in terms of the front loading, I don't know if the question is about, you know, also the effect of potentially front loading a lot of allowances. I guess, you know, I don't really see this, you know, potentially wrecking the CO2 price, because on the one hand, you know, all of this will reduce the demand, I think, for auction allowances because of the reduced emissions, which would be absorbed by the ETS market stability reserve. And, you know, the future supply of allowances going into the will also go down because of the front loading. And, you know, markets are forward looking. So if they anticipate a lower future supply and price that in, this should give a sufficient, you know, price increase already now. So, you know, the EU and you know, market participants that are under the ETS should be able to sell all of those allowances at sufficiently high prices, and also, you know, to have and also the EU to have a serious answer to the IRA. Okay, I think we're, you know, okay, we're having even follow-up. We're having follow-up questions here. So follow-up question. So how much of the production does First Ammonia expect to go to the EU market, and how much does it expect to go to the US market or other markets? You know, you just said, Joel, that you're operating on 5 different continents. I believe you're also opening up, you know, in Latin America at such. How much do you think will go to each of the markets? That's the first question. And will the production in the US be sufficiently big to satisfy both the US and the EU demand? What do you think?
That's an interesting question. So we have sites under development in 5 continents. The selection of sites is not primarily about the market that it's to be used in, although I will come back to that. What we're chasing, aside from the IRA, which we're now chasing, which, you know, that wasn't the original plan, but there it is. What we're chasing is low cost of renewable power. One has to think about power to X, of which hydrogen and ammonia is essentially a part, as really an extension of the renewable power industry. And about half of the cost of our product is what we pay for power. So we're in Chile, where the power price is very low at off peak for a variety of reasons. We're in East Africa, where there's stranded or additional capacity for geothermal, potentially some stranded hydro. This is the basis of our selection of sites. As I mentioned before, ammonia floats, you know, in boats, moves around the world easily. It will move around the world as it does now. A little bit of our selection as a secondary criteria is to be near bunkering hubs, near in the South China Sea, near Singapore, the Straits of Malacca, and the Suez and the Panama Canal in the North Sea. But that's really secondary because ammonia will move around the same way petrochemicals move around. It is our view that the initial production capacity globally, everybody in the market, a lot of announced projects, when green ammonia first becomes available in 2025, will be insufficient to cover all of the demand that is already emerging for 2025. It will take toward the end of the decade for us and our peer producers to start to generate sufficient amounts of green ammonia to meet the growing demand, but the demand will continue to grow out into the future. There are very reasonable projections that the future market, perhaps by the end of the decade, of ammonia will be 4 times the current market, and the production will meet that capacity. As producers, we're generally agnostic and have no reason not to be agnostic as to who buys our product to use where. We originally imagined we would develop a merchant model and take future market risk, because we're very bullish on the future price of ammonia. But we're now actually in a place where we're with this competition for our early product, not only starting in 2025, but throughout the decade. So we will probably have pre-sold much, if not all, of our production for our early facilities before we started to build them. And it seems that much of that will go to Europe. But the other demands that are emerging are from Japan, which has a plan to replace all of its coal-fired power plants to ammonia-fired power plants. So Japan is definitely in the game. We have the global shipping industry, companies that provide fuel to the shippers are starting to position themselves to be able to deliver green ammonia when ammonia ships start to be sailing in the second part of this decade. Places like Singapore want to be bunkering hubs for ammonia for the shipping industry. So from a European perspective, there's going to be a lot of competition for this commodity. We imagine that agriculture will lag fuel in its demand for green ammonia. And yet last week I read that there's a huge industrial agribusiness that has now ordered up a large amount of green ammonia because it wants to make potatoes so that it or some brand will start marketing carbon neutral potato chips. So there's going to be a lot of demand for green ammonia, both now apparently for the traditional use as fertilizer, but also for fuel and power generation. Europe's got to make a bunch of it and also work very hard to secure import of it wherever it's going to be made.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting also to hear about all those extra use cases, for green ammonia. The chat, by the way, is on. The Q&As are on fire. Getting a lot of questions here. One question also is again for Joel. You touched upon a little bit, or we already touched upon it. But what do you think the EU should do to avoid European companies, all going to the US? And will it just be sufficient to increase the size of the innovation fund and streamline the process? What do you think about that?
As I mentioned earlier, there is a physical limitation to the amount of Power-to-X products that can be made in Europe, and that is the ability to generate renewable power. But it's not as bad as one might think, because with our business model, we're operating intermittently, which means we're taking renewable power when there's less demand for it. And we believe that even with the current power-constrained market that Europe is under now, there's still excess renewable power that's going unused, just because of the inevitable built-in inefficiency of when renewable power is generated versus when it's used. So there's scope for growth for domestic production. And I think the answer is yes. if the innovation fund is deemed to be the vehicle for this, if you make it simple enough to apply for and rich enough to compete with the IRA, absolutely. There's no reason why, we would, were that to happen, our 2 sites in Germany, which we can expand with some discussion with our landlords, where both of whom are excellent and supportive, we can end up making on those 2 sites a gigawatt each, and European companies could comfortably produce lots of good sites. And there are pockets of excess renewable power even now before there's new development. And you see, when you draw renewable power intermittently, you're producing the basis for the further development of renewable power. So the power to X production, the way we do it intermittently, not only produces a renewable fuel, but it supports the further development of renewable power. There's a knock-on effect. So I think, when you look at, what's the cost to Europe that it has to put money out in the innovation fund, not only is it spurring domestic production of power to X products, but it's also indirectly generating the financial framework for the development of new renewable power resources.
Yeah, no, that's a very clear answer, and I think, moving on to that also, the scope, we're going a little bit also, this IRA, I feel that it has a bit too much of a negative connotation in terms of, some sort of an unhealthy competition between the US and the EU, because there's also a lot of potential for cooperation. This is also, again, in the great speech from Commission President von der Leyen, where she stresses, cooperation instead of confrontation. Do you both, Hunter and Joel, do you both think that joint standard setting, which she also, I believe, mentioned, do you think that is also an important piece of the puzzle here? Or do you have any other suggestions on how we can bridge the gap in order, for frontrunners like First Ammonia to really thrive on both sides of the Atlantic? Yeah, that's the question, basically.
Well, Hunter, you want to go first?
Sure. I've been thinking about, carbon intensity and life cycle analysis and use of international, ISO standards and methodologies that have been developed, by the Department of Energy. I mean, almost all of that work has been done on a joint basis, the US and Europe working together. And, that's the basis upon which we should continue to work together. Frankly, I believe that, Europe was ahead of the United States, still is ahead of the United States with propositions like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But that is something that is, could be one of the areas of legislative achievement, in a divided Congress, because in the United States, both Republicans and Democrats agree on, using carbon intensity as a standard by which commodities can trade, between our countries, because that offers competitive advantages both to the United States and Europe as we confront, who is the country which is the largest carbon emitter now, which is China. And so it's that type of cooperation that can sort of create in my mind, a virtuous, world competition that drives towards lower carbon intensity. And, go ahead, Joel, I'll stop there.
I completely agree. You've got one set of rules that are being developed as treasury regulations in the United States in connection with the IRA of what qualifies as essentially green. You've got rules being developed in Europe of what's green. As I mentioned earlier, this product or any hydrogen-based product is not going to be used where it's made. There needs to be a global standard. We need to move away from the color coding. There needs to be a carbon scoring. It should be a global standard, and a European American collaboration probably is the best place to start that. And then how that's administered, I leave that to the technocrats. But yeah, that would be a great beginning of a transatlantic collaboration to advance power to X products.
Okay. Well, thanks.
I would just add one other point. That is, I mean, one of the interesting things that we haven't talked about is there was a bill that passed before the IRA, which is called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework, in which there was grant money. That it wasn't a tax bill, but there's money involved and a standard involved, and this was bipartisan in nature, where they defined in the United States there's now a definition of clean hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced at a carbon intensity of 4 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of hydrogen. And so that's set in U.S. law. It's really quite remarkable that there's this statutory definition of clean hydrogen. And so what's happened in the United States is that, yes, green hydrogen is at the top of the pyramid, but it's really about creating a structure where carbon intensity becomes more valuable as it becomes less carbon intensive. And I think that also is really transforming the market in the United States, because it allows for this transition to take place, recognizing that there's going to be lots of different ingenuity in how you get to those lower carbon intensities. And that's something that the U.S. and the EU can cooperate on, just in recognition of all the different ways to make hydrogen, and that as we transition to a green future, there's going to be the idea is to drive to lower carbon intensity over a period of time.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Look, we're at the end basically of a great webinar. I just wanted to, before wrapping up, give you both, is there still a 2-sentence, 20, 30-second key takeaway that you got from today's discussion? Maybe Hunter, you wanna start?
Well, maybe I'll refer a little bit to it just in my last statement, but I think that what's happening in the United States is nothing short of transformational. I don't think that legislators in the U.S. really considered it to be something that is confrontational or intended to put the U.S. ahead of other countries. It's really it's the intention is to create a lower carbon intensive economy in the United States, and it's with that focus, I believe, internationally, that the question becomes, how do we cooperate in terms of trying to achieve the same objectives? But it's not a piece of legislation that was intended to put the U.S. ahead of other countries.
Okay, Joel?
I just want to say that the U.S. does not always get it right. The tax code historically has been a mess and rightly subject to so much criticism. But it's how we do it here. And that's part of why this worked so well and is so elegant, because it didn't invent something new. It took an existing federal regulatory scheme and applied it very simply to this specific purpose. And my recommendation to the EU is probably not to try to invent something new, but to do what the EU does and what the countries within Europe do, only do it in a big way and specifically for this purpose, rather than trying to figure out what we did and do what you do, but do it big and strong, and specifically to enhance the development of domestic production of hydrogen and products within the EU.
Yeah, no, I think I fully agree with that. The EU response, if it can, also bring all the member states closer together, whether it is indeed through that front loading of the Innovation Fund allowances or through the joint borrowing that allows all companies, whether you're from, whatever member state, to access that in order to have an effective answer to the IRA. I think that is the main thing. Also to allow also First Ammonia to really, have those electrolysers, which will, be made in the EU, but also the renewable ammonia made in the EU. I think that would be excellent. So I think we can wrap up here the first episode of First Talks. It was really interesting. Thank you both, Joel and Hunter. The next episode of First Talks will actually be end of January, where we'll be going more into the Critical Raw Materials Act. So stay tuned, and thanks everyone for tuning in.